Okay, let's face it. We all negotiate, like pretty much every day, right?
Yeah.
From deciding what's for dinner
Mm.
to wrangling work projects,
Uh,
even just getting the kids to clean their rooms. It's all negotiation in some form.
it is.
But how often do we actually walk away feeling like, yeah, that went well, I got what I wanted, and the other person's happy?
Right.
More often, it's like we either got steamrolled or we gave in too easily.
Yeah. There's that feeling of, did I get taken advantage of?
Exactly.
Or that maybe I was the one who pushed too hard.
It's tough to find that balance. And so much of it seems to come down to, like, how we think about negotiation in the first place.
Absolutely. And I think most of us, instinctively, we go into it like it's this tug of war, you know?
Yeah.
Someone's going to win, someone's got to lose.
Like at a flea market.
Exactly. You're haggling over the price, and it feels like a battle.
You offer a little less, the seller gives you this stink eye.
And we're thinking, did I just insult their entire family tree with that lowball offer?
Right. It can be so adversarial.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. Even in way more serious situations, that digging in can backfire big time.
It really can. And there are some famous examples. Take, for instance, the U.S. and the Soviet Union back in the day trying to negotiate nuclear inspections.
Yeah, high stakes.
High stakes indeed. The U.S. was pushing for 10 inspections.
Okay.
The Soviets counteroffered with 3. Boom, talks imploded.
Wow.
Both sides so locked into their positions that they missed the bigger picture. I mean, think about it. Both the U.S. and the Soviets ultimately wanted to avoid nuclear war.
Right. That was the common ground they should have been building on.
Exactly. So if, even in a scenario like that, the dig in and fight for every inch approach can fail, it makes you wonder, is there a better way?
Right, because clearly we see successful negotiations happening all the time. So what's the secret? How do we break free of that positional gridlock?
Well, that's what we're going to delve into today, drawing some insights from Getting to Yes, the Negotiation Classic by Roger Fisher and William Ury.
Ah, that's right. I actually remember reading that years ago, but honestly, could use a refresher on those core ideas.
It's a good one. And a lot of it boils down to this, moving beyond that win-lose mindset.
Okay.
It's about aiming for outcomes where everyone feels like they gained something, a win-win, if you will.
I like that. But how do we make that happen when it feels like we're naturally wired to just fight for our own corner?
Well, the first step, and this might sound a bit obvious, but it's often overlooked, is remembering that negotiation isn't just about the issue on the table. It's
Yeah.
about the people involved.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
Because emotions can run HAGH in negotiations.
Absolutely. And they can totally derail things. I bet we've all been there.
Oh, for sure. It's like you start out disagreeing about something simple.
Right.
Let's say pizza versus tacos for dinner.
Yeah.
Suddenly, it's not about the food anymore. It's about, like, defending your entire taste in movies or something.
That's it. We get emotionally entangled. Suddenly, it's personal. It's about proving you're right, winning the argument. It's not about the tacos or the pizza at that point.
Nope.
Mm-hmm.
But, okay, does that mean to be a good negotiator, we all got to become, like, emotionless robots?
No, not at all. It's not about suppressing emotions. It's
Huh.
about recognizing them.
Okay, so more like being aware of them.
Exactly. Being aware of your own ready end feelings in that moment and being aware of the other person's.
Because if I'm all wound up, I'm not going to be thinking clearly anyway.
Right. And if you can sort of acknowledge those feelings, both yours and theirs, it creates a little distance.
Oh, I like that, like stepping back from the heat of the moment.
Yeah, and then you can focus on the substance of the negotiation, the actual problem you're trying to solve.
Makes sense. There's that classic story, right, about the librarian and the argument over the window.
Oh, yeah, that's a great
Two guys are going at it. One wants the window open, the other's freezing.
classic positional standoff.
And instead of picking sides or, like, forcing a compromise, the librarian asks them, well, why is this important to each of you?
Brilliant. Getting to the underlying needs.
Turns out one guy wants fresh air, the other's worried about a draft. So her solution, she opens a window in a different room.
Perfect. Both needs met. No compromise necessary.
It's a great example of how, like, digging a little deeper, you can uncover those underlying whys that are driving people's positions.
Yes, and often those whys are where the real opportunities for agreement lie.
Okay, so that makes sense in theory. But, like, how do we actually do that? How do we figure out those deeper motivations?
Sometimes it's as simple as asking,
Really?
yeah, why is this important to you? Or what are your concerns about this particular point? Just those open-ended questions can be so powerful.
Makes sense. It invites the other person to, like, Explain their thinking rather than just defend their position?
Exactly. And it can unlock a whole new level of understanding, paving the way for solutions neither of you might have considered initially.
Hmm. Reminds me of the negotiations for the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty back in the 70s.
Ah, yes. That one looked impossible for a long time.
Totally deadlocked. Israel wanted to keep part of the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt demanded its full return. Classic positional standoff.
It was. But then they started digging deeper, and they discovered that Israel's real interest wasn't so much about holding on to that specific piece of land.
What was it about then?
Their core concern was security. They wanted to feel safe. Egypt, on the other hand, it wasn't just about territorial control. It was about sovereignty, about being recognized as a fully independent nation.
Okay, so it became about the underlying principles at stake.
Exactly. And once they shifted their focus from positions to interests, it opened up possibilities.
Like what?
They came up with a solution that anyone had initially proposed. The Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt, but it was demilitarized.
Whoa, so it addressed both sides' core concerns.
Precisely. Israel got its security guarantees, Egypt got its sovereignty back. A win-win that wouldn't have been possible if they'd stayed fixated on those initial positions.
That's so cool. It shows that understanding the why behind each side's demands can lead to creative solutions that genuinely benefit everyone. It's not just about, like, dividing up a fixed pie.
Exactly. It's about expanding the pie. It's about what we call inventing options for mutual gain.
Inventing options for mutual gain. I like that. So it's not just about compromise, right? It's about finding ways to create more value for everyone involved.
You got it. But that begs the question, how do we actually do that? How do we generate those innovative ideas?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Well, it often starts with good old brainstorming, but not just random ideas flying around. There's actually a structured approach that can be really helpful.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more.
Picture this, a circle divided into 4 sections.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The first section, you define the problem clearly. What are we really trying to solve here?
Okay, define the problem.
Second section, you analyze it, break it down. What are the different angles? What are the underlying factors at play?
Got it. Analyze.
Then third section, you broaden out. What are some general approaches we could take to address this? No specific solutions yet, just big picture strategies.
Broad approaches.
And finally, in the fourth section, you narrow back down. What are specific, actionable ideas that flow from those approaches? This is where you get concrete.
Okay, so it's like this back and forth between big picture thinking and then, like, zooming in on the detail.
Precisely. And that movement between broad and narrow is where the creative sparks often fly.
So this isn't just like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks.
No, it's a system. There's method to the madness. It helps to break the problem down, examine it from every angle, then build your way back up to a solution.
I can see how that would be useful in all sorts of situations.
It is. There's a great example of this being used in a coal mine. Labor and management were constantly at odds.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine those negotiations were too friendly.
Not always. But they decided to try this circle chart brainstorming approach. And they actually made some real progress.
Don't happen.
They were able to move past their adversarial positions, those us versus them mentalities, and get to the root causes of the conflict. Things like working conditions, safety concerns, addressing those underlying issues rather than just arguing about wages or hours.
Yeah.
It created a more harmonious environment, led to solutions that genuinely benefited both sides.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've talked about separating the people from the problem, focusing on interests, brainstorming creative options. What's the final piece of this puzzle? How do we ensure the solutions we come up with are actually fair?
Right, because fair can be a slippery concept.
Yeah.
What I think is fair, you might disagree with. So how do we move past those subjective battles of will?
Yeah, because I'm totally guilty of getting stuck in those. It just ends up feeling like a head-butting contest.
Yeah.
My way or the highway.
And that's a recipe for disaster in negotiation.
Yeah.
So what's the alternative? Using objective criteria?
Objective criteria. So like what? External standards of some sort.
Exactly. Instead of just relying on what each person thinks is fair, we look to something outside of ourselves.
Okay.
Things like market value, expert opinions, industry benchmarks, legal precedents, whatever's relevant to the situation.
So it's like having a neutral referee, making sure everyone's playing by the same rules.
You got it. Takes
Yeah.
the subjectivity out of it. Think about those law of the sea negotiations. Super complex, right? Countries trying to figure out how to divvy up deep sea mining rights.
Yeah, I can imagine that got messy.
It did. But instead of each country arguing for what they deserved, they used this model developed by MIT to determine a data-driven objective fee for those mining rights.
Whoa, so like an external calculation removed the emotion from it.
Exactly. Took the ego out of the equation. And that helped them reach an agreement much more smoothly. Now, of course, not every negotiation is going to have a handy MIT model lying around, but the principle holds true. Looking for those external benchmarks, those agreed-upon standards, it can help us break free of those my way or the highway deadlocks.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense. But what about those times when, like, even with the best intentions, we're dealing with someone who's not playing by the rules? Someone who's resorting to sneaky tactics, trying to manipulate the situation to get what they want. How do we handle those negotiation ninjas?
Ah, that's a great question. Because, let's face it, not everyone negotiates in good faith.
Oh.
There are folks out there who are more than willing to use pressure tactics, even outright trickery, to get their way. But don't worry, there are ways to counter those tactics effectively.
Okay, good, because I was starting to feel a little helpless. So
Okay.
what are the strategies? What can we do when we sense someone's trying to pull a fast one on us?
Well, that's something we'll dive into in more detail in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned. All right, so picture this. You're in the middle of a negotiation, things are moving along, and you start to get this feeling like the other person, they're not exactly playing by the rules.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
Maybe they're constantly interrupting you.
Or they're using, like, really dismissive language.
Right. Or they keep throwing out these deadlines, trying to pressure you into making a decision.
It's so frustrating. Like, you practically feel yourself getting pushed into a corner,
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's easy to get flustered in those situations.
Totally. You start feeling defensive, and then, you end up reacting emotionally instead of thinking strategically.
And that's exactly what the other person wants. They're trying to throw you off balance.
So how do we avoid that? How do we stay calm and collected when someone's clearly using those kind of, like, psychological warfare tactics?
Well, it's interesting. Instead of trying to fight fire with fire,
Yeah.
think of it more like redirecting their energy. Like in martial arts, you use your opponent's momentum against them.
Oh, okay. I like that analogy.
There's this technique, it's sometimes called negotiation jujitsu.
Negotiation jujitsu. That sounds kind of badass.
It can be pretty effective, and one of the most powerful moves is actually really simple.
Okay, tell me.
Asking questions.
Asking questions.
Yeah. So instead of getting all defensive when they interrupt you or make some outrageous demand,
Uh-huh.
pause for a second and say something like, help me understand why you feel the need to interrupt. Or can you explain why you think that's a reasonable request?
Oh, okay. So instead of letting them control the conversation with their tactics,
You're taking back the reins.
I'm forcing them to justify their behavior.
Exactly. It shifts the dynamic. Now they're the ones on the defensive.
And it also, like, gives you a moment to collect your thoughts, instead of just reacting impulsively.
Precisely. It creates a little breathing room.
Yeah.
And often it leads to a more productive conversation because now they're actually having to articulate their reasoning rather than just throwing out demands or trying to bully you into submission.
I like it. It's a way of subtly calling them out without being confrontational.
Exactly. Now, another really powerful jujitsu move is silence.
Silence. Like just not saying anything.
Yep. When the other side makes an unreasonable demand or launches into some, personal attack.
Sometimes the best response is to just pause. Let the silence hang there for a few beats.
It can be so effective. It creates this, sense of discomfort that often makes them soften their stance.
Oh, I've totally used that in arguments before. Never thought of it as a negotiation tactic, though.
It totally is. That quiet pause, it speaks volumes. And it gives you a chance to reflect and choose your next move strategically.
It's almost like saying, I'm not playing your game. I'm waiting until we can have a reasonable conversation.
Exactly. Now remember, negotiation jujitsu, it's not about being passive.
Right.
It's not about letting the other side walk all over you. It's about skillfully redirecting the conversation back to those principles we talked about earlier. Fairness, mutual gain, objective criteria.
Okay, this is all making sense, but I got to ask, what about those situations where there's like a huge power imbalance? Like I'm negotiating with someone who has way more resources, more influence, more leverage than me. Does this approach even stand a chance?
That's a really important question. And honestly, No negotiation method can guarantee a win against overwhelming odds. It's like trying to arm wrestle a professional weightlifter.
Yeah, not going to win that one.
But even in those situations, there are strategies that can help you protect yourself
Okay.
and make the most of the assets you do have.
So it's not about magically leveling the playing field. It's about playing the hand you've been dealt as strategically as possible.
Exactly. It's about maximizing your potential for a favorable outcome, even when the odds seem stacked against you. And one of the most powerful tools in these situations is understanding your BATNA.
BATNA, yes. Everyone talks about BATNA. But can we, like, break that down in plain English? What does it actually mean? And how can it help me when I'm up against a more powerful opponent?
Okay, so BTNA stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement.
Okay, so it's basically your backup plan.
Exactly, your plan B. If this deal falls through, what are your other options? What's your fallback position?
Oh, okay. So it's like knowing that I'm not completely reliant on this one negotiation to achieve my goals. I have other possibilities.
Right, and the more attractive your BTNA is, the more leverage you have in the negotiation. Think about it. If you know you have a strong alternative, you're not as desperate to reach an agreement.
Which means I can be more confident walking away if the terms aren't favorable.
Exactly. It's like having a safety net so you can be bolder in your requests
Mhm.
because you know you have other options if things don't go your way.
It almost feels like having a secret weapon.
It can feel that way.
Right.
Imagine you're negotiating a job offer and you already have another offer on the table.
Ooh, that's a good BATNA.
It is. You're
Yeah.
not as worried about losing this particular offer because you know you have another one waiting in the wings. So you can be more assertive in negotiating your salary and benefits.
So a strong BATNA gives me the confidence to walk away from a bad deal. It lets me negotiate from a position of strength, even when the other side seems to have all the power.
Precisely. And here's something interesting about BTNAs.
Yeah.
They don't have to be perfect.
No.
They just have to be right. And just as it's important to understand your own BTNA, it can also be helpful to try and assess the other side's BTNA.
Wait, the other person's BTNA?
Yeah. If you have a sense of what their alternatives are, you can anticipate their moves and adjust your strategy accordingly. It's like a game of chess, trying to anticipate your opponent's next move.
This is getting really strategic. So it's not just about knowing my own needs. It's about understanding their position as well.
Exactly. It's about seeing the whole board, understanding the dynamics at play, and making calculated moves that advance your interests while also acknowledging the other side's needs and constraints.
Okay, this is fascinating stuff. But even with the most well-developed BTNA and a keen sense of the other side's alternatives, there are going to be times when the other person just refuses to engage in a fair and reasonable negotiation, no matter how hard we try. What do we do then?
You're absolutely right. Some people are just difficult to negotiate with, even when you're approaching the situation with the best of intentions. But there are still some strategies we can explore to navigate those tricky situations. And that's what we'll get into after we come back.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Learned about separating the people from the problem, focusing on interests, brainstorming creative options, using objective criteria. We even got into some, like, negotiation jujitsu moves for dealing with those tricky tactics some people use.
Right, those psychological games.
Exactly. But even of all that, there are times when, no matter how hard we try to be collaborative and principled, the other person just won't budge.
It's true. You can encounter those folks who seem determined to dig in their heels and resist any attempt at finding common ground.
Yeah, and it's so frustrating. Like, you're trying to have a rational conversation, and they're speaking a completely different language.
It can feel that way. It's like you're both playing different games with different rules.
Exactly. So what do we do in those cases? Is it time to wave the white flag and walk away?
Not necessarily. Sometimes what you need is a fresh perspective, someone from the outside to help break through that impasse.
You mean like a mediator?
Exactly. A skilled mediator can act as a neutral third party, helping to facilitate the conversation and guide both sides toward a resolution.
Okay, so they're not there to, like, take sides or impose a solution. They're more like a facilitator.
Right. Their role is to help de-escalate the tension, keep the conversation focused, and encourage both sides to really listen to each other and try to understand where the other is coming from.
That makes sense. Sometimes we get so caught up in our own WN perspective that it's hard to see the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And a mediator can help provide that broader perspective, pointing out areas of potential compromise or suggesting alternative solutions that neither side might have considered on their own.
Okay, so bringing in a mediator can be helpful. But how does that actually work in practice? Like, what's the process?
Well, there are different approaches, but one interesting technique is called the one-text procedure.
One text procedure. What's that?
So, in this method, the mediator works with both sides to create a draft agreement,
Let's go.
a document that reflects everyone's interests and concerns.
So it's not like each side submits their own proposal and then they argue over it.
No, it's a more collaborative process. The mediator starts with a blank slate and works with both sides to craft a solution that meets everyone's needs as best as possible.
So they're kind of like weaving together the different perspectives into one cohesive agreement.
That's a great way to put it. And the mediator keeps refining the draft based on feedback from both sides, incorporating everyone's input until they reach a version that everyone can agree to.
That sounds a lot more constructive than just battling it out, each side trying to get their way.
It is. It creates a sense of shared ownership over the final agreement, which can make it more likely that everyone will stick to it in the long run.
Hmm. So even in those really tough negotiations, there are ways to find common ground and reach agreements that benefit everyone involved.
Absolutely. And even if you don't end up bringing in a formal mediator, adopting that collaborative mindset can make a world of difference. It's about shifting the focus from me versus you to us working together to find a solution that works for everyone.
I love that. It's like remembering that we're all on the same team, ultimately.
Right? We're all trying to achieve a positive outcome, even if our initial positions seem miles apart.
This whole deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I have a whole new toolkit for approaching negotiation.
Yeah.
It's not about those aggressive tactics or power plays we so often see in movies or in the news. It's about a more nuanced, collaborative, and ultimately more effective way of communicating and reaching agreements that benefit everyone involved.
That's exactly what we were hoping you'd take away from this. And remember, negotiation is a skill. The more you practice these principles, the more natural and intuitive they will become.
It's like anything. The more you do it, the more comfortable and confident you become. And I love how these techniques can be applied in so many different areas of life, from those big formal negotiations to just everyday interactions with family, friends, and colleagues.
You got it. Whether you're navigating a complex business deal or just figuring out where to go for dinner with your family, these principles can help you communicate more effectively, build stronger relationships, and create outcomes that leave everyone feeling good.
So as we wrap up, any final words of wisdom to leave our listeners with, something to inspire them to take action and put these principles into practice in their own lives?
How about this? Think about a negotiation you're facing or anticipating in the near future. It could be anything, big or small. Now ask yourself, which of these principles could make the biggest difference in that specific situation? And what's one small change you can make in your approach based on what we've discussed today?
That's a great question. It's about taking these concepts out of the theoretical realm and finding ways to apply them in our everyday lives. And who knows, maybe those small changes will lead to some big wins.
I hope so. And remember, we're all learning here. Negotiation is an ongoing journey, and we can all learn from each other. So if you have any success stories or even any negotiation challenges you'd like to share, we'd love to hear about them.
Absolutely. We're all in this together. So until next time, happy negotiating, everyone.